Welcome back, folks, to An Ape's Guide to Human Language. We are trying to understand what's going on for our curious primate, investigating this question of what it is that humans do with language that allows them to do things that other primates cannot. We're going to start this mini lecture where we left off in our lecture together, asking about how we may have acquired all of these differences that we've been looking at in the shape, structure, and morphology of the skull. We've talked already about how the bony parts of the skull, including the cheekbone and the size of and shape of the mandible, tell us something about the muscles that are involved in jaw manipulation. We've also talked about how the bony part at the back of the skull tells us about the orientation of the human skull relative to the spine. And we've talked about how the shape and structure of our teeth might be telling us things not only about the food that we eat, but about the kind of primate society that we live in. So what could be tying some of these features together, and how on earth do we get on this evolutionary trajectory? So I'm going to take us back for a little bit of a thought experiment to Darwin. Although you'll be familiar with Darwin from his ideas about the evolution of species, not so many of us are familiar with the idea that Darwin also proposed domestication syndrome. So this was the idea that when you looked at domesticated animals, they looked different from their wild types in ways that were shared across species that look very different. So when you looked at the traits that are associated with domestication in animals, he noticed a bunch of things often patterned together, even in species that were unrelated. So this included increased docility and tameness, changes in the color of the coat of the domesticated versus the wild type, reductions in the size of the different teeth, changes in the craniofacial morphology, and alterations to both ears and tails. He also noticed that there were changes in fertility cycles, adaptations in the adrenal system, and how this was related to stress responses, changes in the concentration of neurotransmitters. He also described prolongations in juvenile behavior. That is, that traits that you would normally see in very young infants of a species were carried through for a much longer period of time. The other thing that he noticed was some kind of a reduction in total brain size of particular brain regions. So let's look at an example of this in one species that you might be able to recognize. This beautiful graphic brings together the skulls of a bunch of different canines. So at the top, you can see some wild canines, the gray wolf. And you can see it from three different orientations: from above, from the side, and from underneath, where we can see the full shape of the dental arcade. And then in each subsequent row, we see a different dog species that has been bred by humans. So we have Great Danes up here, Rottweilers, Greyhounds, a Yorkshire Terrier, and a Pug. Now, the first thing I'm going to mention is we've been looking at zygomatic arches in our previous content, and you can see that gigantic hole here. What that's telling us is, once again, in this species, just like some of the primates we looked at, the ability to load the jaw with strength is very important, and the size of the muscle tissue is enormous. As we go through these domesticated species, we see a lot of changes going on, but perhaps the most pronounced of them is the reduction in the size of the lower face. So the wolf has a very long face compared to animals like the pug, which has a very short face, and this is referred to as prognathism. So with domestication comes a reduction in the prognathism, of the different species. So we might ask, what is the driver of face shape that comes along with domestication? And I want us to talk a little bit about an experiment that I find incredibly interesting, that involves an animal you might not necessarily think of when you think of domestication.
I really think that the Belyaev experiments was one of the most significant experiments in evolution that took place in the 20th century. And it affected my life and my thinking in so many ways.
The experiment was begun in the 1950s at a fox farm in Siberia. The foxes were being bred for their fur, but they were wild animals that were hard to handle and often too stressed to breed. Dmitry Belyaev, a geneticist, was taken on to see if he could develop foxes that would be easier to keep. He began his experiment by breeding together those foxes with the least excitable temperaments. Belyaev selected foxes by a simple method. He extended a gloved hand into each animal's cage. The foxes that attacked, cowered, or bit him were excluded from breeding. But those that showed tolerance or curiosity were mated together. In effect, Belyaev was selecting the foxes for their flight distance. The subsequent results were staggering. The new generations of foxes were transformed not just in behavior, but in their appearance. Within just 10 years, the selected foxes showed new variety in their color. Some were born with mottled coats or black and white patches. Their ears became floppy. They started to bark, vocalize. They became highly playful even into adulthood and were no longer afraid of people. Some of the foxes even began to answer to their names. Belyaev had stumbled across the discovery that selecting for the quality of tameness alone could set off a cascade of other changes. We can still see evidence of this quantum leap at the same research center today.
Up to that point, we all kind of believed Darwin. And Darwin said, nature does not go in leaps. Things don't happen fast. They happen gradually. And the answer was, with Belyaev's experiment, he was wrong. They do go in leaps, and sometimes big leaps, things that you wouldn't expect. The theory is that we're dealing with some underlying structure. When we're dealing with tameness, we're dealing with a set of genetics that is producing a characteristic response.
It is not a coincidence that many domesticated animals are black and white. When selection is made for tameness, it impacts on the entire makeup of the animal. Scientists have determined that adrenaline, the fight or flight hormone, and melanin, the skin and fur pigment, are chemically connected, so they change together, as are the neurotransmitters dopamine and noradrenaline, which control behaviors. Affect one system, and there is a domino effect, from color to behaviors. Coppinger's scavenging wolves may have undergone a similar transformation.
When all of a sudden Belyaev did his experiments, it changed the way a lot of us began to think about dogs. People talked about, why did people select dogs to have this coat color or that coat color and so on? Why did people select dogs to bark? And then all of a sudden we realized those were a bunch of really silly questions, because we could get all of that just by selecting for tameness.
Belyaev had created foxes that looked and behaved like dogs. His experiment suggested that the transformation of the wild wolf into the dog could have happened in the blink of an evolutionary eye. The stage was set for the development of the dog into the incredible variety we have today.
Let's look at what the results of this breeding program look like now.
Fox number 1.
So that is me, locked in a pen in San Diego. And that is a very special red fox from Russia. We're testing whether the fox likes me because it's actually bred to be friendly towards people. And in that moment, I'm really hoping it passes the test.
I'm just minding my own business.
But they've learned that being domesticated is one thing. Being man's best friend is another.
While they are certainly tame, they're fascinating and incredible animals, they're still foxes. And when you domesticate a fox, you don't make a dog. You make a domesticated fox, any more than when you domesticate a horse, you make a dog.
So Belyayev did not recreate the dog. But for anyone studying how wolves evolved into dogs, the foxes might still represent a behavioral stepping stone.
They're on a path to doghood, if you like.
Clive Wynne is a professor of psychology at Arizona State. He studies the unique relationship between dogs and people, and the way that dogs go above and beyond simple friendliness towards humans.
Dogs have this emotional availability, I sometimes call it hypersociability, that they are so very, very ready and willing to form emotional relationships.
According to Clive, at least 14,000 years ago, hypersocial dogs emerged from a population of wild wolves. And no one's really sure how it happened.
I mean, that is the million-dollar question, and we don't exactly know.
But the Belyayev foxes might offer a clue. Clive and his team have a simple test to see how far along the foxes are on their path to doghood. And they told us how to carry it out.
So the experiment is really simple. I have a 1 meter radius circle all the way around me, and they're gonna bring in a fox one at a time into this enclosure.
The idea was to see how much of 2 minutes the foxes would spend inside my circle. We tried first with the 3 Belyayev foxes, and one by one, they trotted up, sniffed me, and then relaxed somewhere else. Which has been Clive's experience with the foxes too.
They greet and they interact, and then they move on.
For comparison, we also tested a fox that was hand-reared by humans, but genetically wild. It never set foot inside the radius, and it never relaxed. And for a final contrast, we tested a dog.
I gotta ignore you for 2 minutes.
Afterwards, we got to spend some more time with the Belyayev foxes, and they were completely tame with us, just not so friendly. Clive and the Bassets suspect that this is because of their early lives as lab animals. They were bred for generations to be friendly, but then barely socialized as youngsters. And that's important, too.
The fact that I'm such a nice guy isn't just the beautiful genes that I inherited from my parents, but the experiences of life that I've had along the way.
Clive and his team plan to keep studying fox behavior, to build out a roadmap for how dogs became dogs. But locked inside each of those foxes is another roadmap, one that might help explain domestication in any animal.
In some situations, it's like a single gene. In some situations, still a few genes.
Anna Kukekova is a professor of animal sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Since 2002, she's been collaborating with the Institute in Russia on genetics research. Her goal is to reach the absolute core of the fox experiment, the specific genes involved in fox domestication. And a few weeks ago, she and her team published a paper in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution that made a lot of progress.
Now we know that there are about 100 regions in fox genome which in some way can contribute to some behaviors, tame behavior, friendly behavior, or aggressive behavior.
Anna's research is valuable because it directly compares the genes of wild and domesticated foxes. We can do that with wolves and dogs, but we can't infer as much about it. As dogs evolved, friendliness just wasn't the only trait that mattered. For example, they also had to digest human food. So we can see which genes changed from wolves to dogs, but it's harder to know whether those really are behavior genes. On the other hand, there was only one fox trait that Belyayev selected for, friendliness towards humans. So here, it's a little easier to associate behavior with DNA.
Can we actually nail down some regions to a single gene and try to demonstrate that this gene actually has effect on behavior? And we were successful. And
This is such a big deal because there's a lot of overlap in mammalian genes. So these genes that Anna found, they could help us understand domestication across the board. And given that, it's possible that we could use gene editing tools to domesticate entirely new animals in the lab. Maybe.
Yeah, we're thinking about that. I have doubts that we ever will be able to create mouse which wags its tail. I don't think it will work, but we'll see.
So, we've seen that by selectively breeding foxes, simply for the lack of aggression, the lack of fear-threat response out of a wild fox population, we're able to achieve something that starts to look like domestication. Let's have a look at some of those genetic cascades. By simply selecting for behavior, the adrenaline system is linked to melanin and coat coloring, and the dopamine system is linked to the neurotransmitter of noradrenaline, and this leads to changes in physiology as well as changes in behavior, so those childlike responses that are preserved for a lot longer. Another point that Darwin pointed out was this idea of neoteny, childlike traits in the physiology of animals. So if we compare on an equal scale what a human would look like if their body were proportioned like that of an infant on the same scale, we would see that the head would be a lot larger relative to the body. And this is something that's observed in other domesticated species. This has to start bringing us this question: is there some way in which some of the changes that we've seen in the physiology of our primate species, things to do with the change in the structure of the facial morphology, so that shortening of the snout, the reduced prognathism in the human primate relative to our other primate relatives, is it possible that we are self-domesticated? Geneticists have been investigating what the genetic pathways might be, and one of the current theories is the idea that there is one set of genes that regulates the entire neural crest. That is the pathway that develops very early in developing fetus, the neural crest that develops down the spinal cord, and that this neural crest gene cascade is controlling a lot of these different gene expressions. So, self-domestication in humans, is it possible? Might it be happening? Well, what would be required for that to be the case? It would mean that we would require, as a species, sexual selection for less aggressive mates, and this might bring with it the advantage of increased cooperative behaviors. This might allow us larger group sizes, which is kind of aligned with this social grooming hypothesis. The idea that we might use our eyes, for example, to signal to each other. The idea that we might use muscles in our face to produce specific facial gestures for each other. And those anatomical changes might be a consequence of selecting simply for behaviors. So our kind of weirdly big heads relative to our bodies, the fact that our faces are a little more childlike compared to other primate species. We have changes in eye pigmentation, changes in coat coloration, hair color, for example. We have less prognathism, and we have like weirdly big heads. So here's just one more overview of this idea of that salient craniofacial differences between anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals might be in some way mimicking what we see between domesticated dogs and wild-type wolves. So in Primate Zoo Observation Guide, we also have this brief summary. So, for our curious ape, it seems like cooperation and grooming and mate selection might lead to lower aggression, and this could change the shape of my face and jaw. But how will I eat? Which we will return to in the coming weeks. And just to bring us back to our summary overview of the anatomical content that we'll be reviewing in the class. So far, we've talked about differences in limbs and spines and eyes. We've started looking at how our face shape might be related to other behaviors, including perhaps self-domestication and longer vocal tract. We'll be touching base next time with issues to do with being a walking primate and what that means for different parts of our anatomy. And we shall follow it up in our progress towards acquiring a big brain. Look forward to seeing you after the lecture break. Good luck with preparation for your PsyComs projects. See you next time.